I am unmuted and very glad to be unmuted because now I can welcome you to this wonderful event that we call Digital Fieldwork Symposium, Ethics and Methods. I welcome you on the part of CLACS, Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, which in collaboration with the Portuguese and Spanish department at NYU, we've convened to this very important event because we are challenged on how to do and how to reflect on the epistemological, methodological, ethical, and practical challenges of doing digital fieldwork. When COVID-19 spread around the world, it transformed all facets of our lives, including the research projects we were involved in. Travel and face-to-face fieldwork were restricted, and the internet became the dominant research venue. Even before the pandemic, however, many researchers were already finding innovative ways to update traditional research methodologies using a wide array of digital sources. Accordingly, our invited speakers will share their experiences and in developing robust digital research methods characterized by their flexibility and creativity. And we're delighted to introduce them today. First, I'm gonna introduce them to the panel. Each one of them is going to talk for 20 minutes. And then the second part of the event will be for Q&A and comments. And yeah, I want to introduce first to Melissa Gasparotto, who's an Associate Director of Research Services and Institutional Partnerships for the New York Public Library Research Libraries. Her research and recent publications explore changing models of open access, publishing, and eBook discovery in Latin America and the global information ecology around digital content. She is active in a variety of professional organizations and consortia, including the Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin American Library Materials, Latin American Northeast Libraries Consortium, and the Latin American Research Resources Project. She earned an MA in Latin American and Caribbean Studies from New York University, which is a pleasure to know and have shared time with you, Melissa, in our MA program. And she also earned an MS in Library and Information Science from Long Island University. Our second guest speaker is Ana Alvarez, who holds a degree in anthropology from the University of Buenos Aires and a PhD in gender and Latin American studies from Bielefeld College, and has taught at the universities of Bielefeld, Germany, London, and Zurich. And as an activist and academic, she has been among the first social scientists to conduct fieldwork with travesti and trans women communities in Buenos Aires since the 90s, and has participated in gay, lesbian, travesti, transsexual, transgender, and bisexual and feminist political movements and gender rights advocacy in Argentina, where she was a participant of the area queer at the University of Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires' Centro Cultural Ricardo Rojas. Her work has been published in academic journals and collections, most recently in the anthology Latin American Cultural Studies, in ABA, etc. And then we have Patricia Oliart, who's a senior lecturer in Latin American Studies and head of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies in the School of Modern Languages at Newcastle University. She recently edited Pedagogías de la Disidencia en América Latina. Other publications are about the circumstances and particular shape that emancipatory ideas take in political and intellectual life of individuals in Peru. and her current project is about youth, cultural and political collectives and the political subjectivities emerging around them in Latin America. She's preparing a book on youth activism in Peru in the past 20 years. Patricia, Melissa, Ana, very welcome to this event, and les damos la palabra. Primero a Melissa. Adelante.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I feel like I became a researcher at your knee, and so it is just a continual delight to exchange ideas with you and to be a part of this symposium and all of your other events. And if I could just give one word of unsolicited advice to everyone here. If Pamela Kaya asks you to do something, you say yes. There is one right answer, and it is yes. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I'm going to share my slides. Okay, so today my talk is titled Fieldwork at a Distance, Navigating Technology-Mediated Research Methods, Ethics, and Best Practices. And just briefly, I'll tell you a little bit more about my research so you have a better sense of how I'm located within the conversation for today. I've been a librarian for the last 15 years and working broadly on issues related to the visibility and circulation of online content from Latin America with an eye toward equitable access. And currently, my research project is exploring internet governance in a human rights framework, particularly as it relates to the visibility of minority language digital content throughout Latin America. And that touches on issues from the physical infrastructure access to the private sector's role as a gatekeeper of public information in the form of search engines, to the extractive nature of algorithmic information exposure, to the teaching of computer programming using English language curriculum throughout Latin America, the lack of standard orthography for many indigenous languages, which results in poorer algorithmic treatment and visibility, and so on. So digital fieldwork has always been part and parcel of what I do myself in my research. And over the years, I've been able to help other researchers and students think through their own research design and tool selection. So I'm going to start by setting the scene with some observations and questions that I wrestle with. And along the way, I'll highlight a couple of scholars doing some really interesting thinking about digital methods. And then the second half of my talk, I'll move into some really practical resources that can help you navigate the digital fieldwork landscape, not just now, but well post-COVID. Okay, so when we talk about moving to conducting fieldwork at a distance, we're introducing not only new methods to manage that communication, observation, and data collection, but we're introducing a whole layer of technology that wasn't always necessary in in-person environment. And that layer has a lot of associated practical and ethical concerns. Those concerns aren't limited to the impact these technologies might have on participant privacy and safety, for example, and issues of that nature are typically already addressed by existing discipline-based ethical guidelines and standards on field research. But the use of digital methods and tools also raises some interesting questions about how their place in the research process might fundamentally change the nature of and the quality of the interactions we have with individuals, as well as the data we might be collecting as a result. Digital methods are pretty well developed at this point across most of the humanities and social sciences disciplines. For example, digital ethnography has a very robust literature going back 2 decades or more. And I'll point you towards some of that later. But when I think about digital fieldwork and the pressing questions around it, I think the most rapidly changing piece is actually in the area of ethics. One of the clearer illustrations of that set of issues that comes to mind is from the work of Halcyon Lawrence, who's a scholar working on code switching in Trinidad and Tobago. And she talks about how native speakers of accented Englishes are forced to assume a completely different identity when interfacing with their own phones. For example, when using Siri, because they cannot make full use of their technology without changing the way they speak to be understood by the phone's voice control. She talks about witnessing a person unsuccessfully using Siri with their natural Trinidad and Tobago English, who then immediately and seamlessly switches to an American accent in order to use her phone. And then she unpacks that and what does it mean when the use of our ubiquitous technology requires you to sacrifice a core part of your identity in the form of the way you speak. And I observe, and probably you have observed this too, a related phenomenon every day, because my partner is a native speaker of English from the Philippines, who just routinely hands me her phone or the TV remote so that I can repeat something she just said as a white American, so that I can feed the machine what it's capable of understanding. We joke that our TV is being racist, but it's not actually a joke, is it? Right? These are real questions, and that's just related to English language content. We haven't even begun to address the complexity in the multilingual environment and what it means to have meaningful enjoyment of the right to communicate for speakers of all languages. It's such a widespread barrier that even variation within a single major language quickly exposes how ill-equipped the most ubiquitous communication tools are. And we need to account for that as researchers as we select the tools we're using to work with community partners abroad. And it's not just our data collection tools that get caught up in this either, but the tools we have for analyzing data. Let me use an example from the digital humanities that happened to me a couple of years ago. I don't know how familiar you are with the HathiTrust Digital Library. It's an amazing resource. It is the online library of Babel. But it used to be that when you tried to use some of their text extraction and classification algorithms on sets of texts in Spanish, you got a very quick lesson in the limits of digital tools developed in the global north, even by well-meaning nonprofit consortia, to handle content produced elsewhere. So my favorite example is when I extracted place names from two separate corpora of digital editions of Don Quixote, one in translation in English, one in the original Spanish. And I wanted to compare the algorithmic treatment of these two sets of the same text, but in different languages. And in the Spanish language corpus, the words that were pulled out and tagged with indicators included the word la, which was consistently tagged as a geographic term because the algorithm read it as LA, as in Los Angeles. So they eventually did upgrade the algorithm. So now you can choose the dominant language in your work set, but they only include a few languages because the technology is lagging behind the content that's available for analysis. So, and I in no way mean to disparage HathiTrust. They do incredible work. They have built a collection of global texts that is really unparalleled in terms of research potential. But it does illustrate that the equitable treatment of global data by analysis tools that you might use in your research is always evolving. And it's just something that you should be aware of. So for these reasons, I would start this whole conversation about digital fieldwork by foregrounding the question of technology bias and how it might change what and how our colleagues, community partners, contacts in other regions might be saying through these mediation tools to begin with, or how existing research data might be presented without appropriate context. And I would argue that this is pretty significant. And, of course, any research that requires IRB approval will ask you to state risks. And so you'll be prompted to think about and articulate some of this. But not all of these issues fall within that category, but I think they still bear thinking about as you develop your research plan. And then, of course, not to make things more complex, but all of the reverse of what I just said could also be true. That is, the very fact of a digital tool's role as a mediator may actually give some other groups and communities the space to be more authentic. And so it's complicated and it's never neutral, right? That's the bottom line. The technology we select for our research is never neutral. And I think that these kinds of issues require a little more sustained thinking on our part than they would have in the non-technologically mediated engagement that we were used to before COVID. And so there is a lot of really great writing on these kinds of issues in the context of each discipline. I mentioned earlier digital ethnography, but also new media studies. There's some great literature from post-colonial studies perspective on this. But the pandemic has really put a fire under other areas to start defining some new ethics and spelling out some additional best practices. So this is all to say that early on, whenever you're developing your research plan, I think it's important that we all ask ourselves, are we inviting people to virtually participate in or contribute to our work in a way that requires them to leave some of themselves behind in order to use the tools that we've provided, to inhabit a digital space that is so uncomfortable that they're unable to present an authentic self, to compromise some of their own values, let's say around privacy, or where our methods require the use of existing data sources. Does the analysis tool we've selected reveal new truths about that data, or does it in some way decontextualize it due to technology bias. And in this way, we can acknowledge that the selection of a technical tool or platform for virtual fieldwork is something that we should spend a lot of time on. I want to just briefly highlight a couple other issues that bear some thinking as well. These are ones I really grapple with myself, and I don't have answers. These are more provocations than anything else. But I think another set of questions to think about around the transition to virtual methods is related to the invisible labor behind the digital environment. And I'll use an example of research conducted using social media platforms. So Facebook is a really good example because of their program called Facebook Zero, where they negotiate with cell phone networks around the world to provide access to their platform to all cell phone holders at no cost or data charges. And primarily, this program is available in the global south. So, of course, this is smart on their part because it allows them to increase their market share. It's a ubiquitous platform in a way that other platforms may not be. And that makes it a really enticing platform for digital fieldwork. But if you're working with individuals or communities via Facebook, are you foregrounding the experiences of the content moderators who vet what appears and what gets blocked? Sarah T. Roberts, in her book Behind the Screen, Content Moderation in the Shadows of Social Media, digs into the impact of content moderation that's been outsourced to the global south, in the Philippines in particular, including the mental and emotional costs of viewing disturbing content all day, every day. That's what allows these platforms to function for us. So it's just to emphasize that the ethics of a fieldwork platform selection might need to acknowledge the global labor that's working behind the scenes to enable the platform's success. And this is not to say that using Facebook for communication with individuals or groups or communities is itself an ethical problem, but I'd argue that the larger landscape should somehow be acknowledged. Another question I wanted to put out today is about land and climate change as an ethical issue related, although not exclusively, to virtual fieldwork. We're certainly using a variety of data storage practices as we conduct interviews, and that results in lots of large files. We're collecting and storing thousands of digitized documents and photos in cloud-based services. We're buying new equipment, and although this is all fairly normal practice in normal times for research, whether it's local or abroad, I think it's important to acknowledge that the cloud has a very physical presence in the world, and that comes in the form of data centers requiring enormous amounts of energy to keep cool. And that has a measurable contribution to rising climate temperatures around the globe. And it's not exactly an issue in our power to solve, but it's part of the larger picture. And of course, I mean, the problem of e-waste is very well documented. It continues to grow as our discarded computers and phones are shipped to other countries, particularly Thailand and the Philippines, where they are a significant source of pollutants. I wanted to draw your attention to a book of essays that just came out from MIT Press called Your Computer is on Fire. And I am waiting for it in the mail with bated breath, but I attended their book launch last week, or maybe it was earlier this week, where they gave readings from each of their contributions. And it was just phenomenal. And just to highlight the direction that this kind of thinking and research is moving, there's a section in this book called Nothing is Virtual, with subsections called The Cloud is a Factory and Your AI is a Human. So research like this really underscores the need to keep the people, the land, the climate at the front of our minds as we develop our methods. And so, not to be a complete downer on a Friday morning, sorry. But I mean, at the end of the day, right, a thorough vetting of our research, our digital fieldwork tools, leads us to ask the question, who are all of the people involved in this research? And what is our responsibility to surface and acknowledge their contributions and experiences, regardless of their actual presence in the study itself? And I understand that, again, these are not answers, these are just questions. And in many cases, we just won't be able to 100% square our values with our methods. That's where I landed on this. But the conversation is one that's worth having, right? Okay, so with that in mind, let's just talk about some practical matters, resources to support your development of a research plan in the digital environment. And because I didn't know what disciplines would be represented here today, I have a sort of grab bag of librarian goodies that are broad enough in scope to interest everyone, I hope. So first up, I have not included any of the recent literature, the million articles on adapting your research methods for COVID in discipline A, B, or C, for the simple reason that they're super easy to find. And, you can there's just so many of them. So here it's just a quick illustration. Google Scholar is a very low barrier to entry way to dip your foot into this kind of research. And just a super simple search like this, adapting ethnographic research methods, COVID, will direct you to a lot of really useful case studies. There's some great reflective pieces out there where scholars are reflecting on how they adapted their models, whether they would do it that way again, what are the drawbacks to this approach. And I think just entering into that conversation via this newly published literature could really aid your research design from the get-go. So definitely recommend doing that. Second, so guidelines and best practices documents are all over the place. I wanted, to underscore the continued relevance of existing ethical guidelines from your association. They're there. They're still meaningful. They can provide a larger framework depending on your discipline, but they don't always get down into the nitty gritty and answer some of the pressing questions you might have when conducting digital field research in the way that maybe other organizations do. And so I would invite you to explore the ethical guidelines provided by other organizations, which is maybe something that you've never thought of doing before. But in particular, I'd refer you to the Association of Internet Researchers. They just updated their ethical guidelines. They've been around for 20 plus years, right? Internet research is not new. So there are these robust guidelines that exist. And in particular, let's say the American Association of Anthropology guidelines have a section on informed consent, but it's very short, it's very general, and it doesn't go into questions like, what does it mean to have informed consent when I'm scraping Twitter data? But the Internet Research Ethics does go into great detail about examples like that. So I'm just going to open that up briefly and show you. Let's see, can you see this? And just take you on a tour of the table of contents. I mean, this is it's an 83-page document. So they really go into minute detail on some of these sticky questions. But they walk you through the structure of this ethical document. And then they go into all kinds of related questions in addition to the very specifics involving how do you ethically evaluate the algorithms that might be used in a tool that you're employing for your research. So that is available to you. Let's go back to this. Can you guys see my presentation again? Okay, thanks. Oops. So the next resource I want to point out that's available to you is the crowdsourced bibliography. Crowdsourcing bibliographies is a cool teaching tool, but then it also results in a really amazing resource that could be shared and used. And this one was put together by a professor in Australia, and it was designed as a way to just help researchers immediately minimize in-person risk when conducting their research, to just sort of make that quick switch. But it evolved to include a whole bunch of methods around born digital research methods. And so it's now this very robust 40-page document with that's pretty evergreen. It's useful, COVID or no. And I'm just going to open that one up too and just show you what kinds of tools are here. So you'll see the table of contents goes into detail about how to use specific types of data collection, specific forms of engagement. And then when you click on any of these, there will be an introductory text followed by a little bibliography to point you in a further direction. And this is just an incredibly rich resource that was contributed to by people across the disciplines around the globe. And it's a lovely resource I recommend taking a peek at. And then, of course, there are the standard books that you might remember from long ago. I think a lot of these things have kind of fallen out of favor. The handbook in graduate practice, people just sort of assume that they don't need to refer to these kinds of core textbook manual type things, but they're super helpful and they continue to be published and updated. So in particular, if you're exploring a new digital method, check out the SAGE Handbook series, which you can get to from the NYU Library website or the New York Public Library website. And if you don't have a New York Public Library card, you can sign up for one online. I have to make that pitch. And so these are really helpful resources as well. And I'm just, I don't have a link here, so I'm not going to show you that. But I do invite you to check these out and see if there is a handbook that's related to your particular research topic. And then increasingly, university presses are developing these rapid response series that get books issued on current topics much more quickly than they were before. So, I mean, of course, there are questions about quality in the speedy to publication environment. And so take it, with that in mind. And yet there are some really high quality series that are useful. So this one in particular from Bristol University Press that has 3 volumes on everything from methods to ethics to, and everything in between. So there are those types of resources as well. And then finally, there are phenomenal resources that have been put together by professional organizations around the world. And YouTube is the platform where you can find a lot of those. So at a previous talk that Pamela asked me to do, and I said yes, I mentioned that this was back in March, this series was just beginning. And so at that time, I was just excitedly waiting to attend these sessions. But they ended up hosting 16 different panel discussions over the course of a couple of months about field research in anthropology in Mexico during COVID. And the topics and the individuals address far more than that perspective. I mean, anthropology in Mexico is already a pretty broad topic, but even so, it's much broader in scope than you might imagine. I strongly recommend that you take a gander through these 16 videos that are on YouTube. They are just phenomenally interesting. There is, of course, you'll see issues of technological equity throughout because lots of the presenters struggled with connections. So that's a constant recurring thing in this whole series. But at the same time, just the information and the information sharing is just extraordinary. So I think that's it for my slides. And just very finally, I will close with a recommendation that you speak to your local friendly librarian as you develop your research proposal. It's not self-interested here. It's just, it's good because, we work with researchers across so many different disciplines and topics that we are all generalists in addition to specialists in whatever area we have a background in. And at the very least, we can help serve as a bridge to help get you where you're going. And it is our pleasure to do so. So I think with that, I'm going to stop sharing and listen with great interest to Ana and Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Damos la palabra a Ana. Adelante.
Omar, acordate que no sé hacer nada, por favor. So, let me see. I don't know if I am sharing the...
Not yet.
I don't know if are we sharing my presenter view? I am sharing my screen or not? I can't see it.
No, we cannot see it.
And on the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a green button that says share screen.
Yeah.
That takes you to show us your screen.
Where? Sorry. Here. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, I think that's a way to begin my presentation. Not precisely a digital person myself. I don't know if you can see it now. Okay, great. So I'm going there. Better at least now you see it. No?
Yeah.
Okay. So it was thank you for the invitation. It was very interesting to listen Melissa's work. I began to feel anxious of all the things that I don't know. And exactly, I am coming from exactly the opposite space, which I think it will be very interesting to share then. For me, well, I have been doing field work on and off for more than 25 years now, always in the same field. There is travesti and now trans women communities, first in Buenos Aires and then in Europe as well, always in Buenos Aires too. But I would say my fascination is the real field work. Yeah, so it was my formation as an anthropologist. It was, that's the real thing. Then So then they are other things, but the important thing as discipline is our real fieldwork, yeah, our present fieldwork. And my relation with digital has to work through my constant moving around the world, and also the moving of the activists and the trans women, who many of them are sex workers, so they have a much clear use of digital technology that I have, for instance, and the way that they have to move in order to survive. So in this sense, I have to say that my real presential field work brought me to work with technology, but I am always behind my research, sort of. So I think is what I will try to think about is exactly coming from the opposite way, coming from the idea of the real field work is the field work that we do in front of the other person. And I began to have problems with how to incorporate the constant everyday use of the internet and the different platforms. And as you will see, it's very difficult to include this in this kind of myth of the field work, isn't it? Because that's not the real thing. So we are doing that, but that's like the side dish. The important thing is, when we go there and we put our cork hat and we run into the jungle, yeah. So this is a bit of the idea, yeah, of the presentation. I hope I can manage to present something interesting. So the idea is bricoleur's work, reconstructing travesti cabaret or nightlife in Buenos Aires through the internet. Yeah. So as Melissa was saying, there are many manuals, and I began again to grab my old manuals, from my old times, and trying to remember what methodology looks like now. Yeah. And the first thing that I'm going to say is, that they had the same problems that I have. No, good methodology manuals deal with the difficulties of prescribing rules on fieldwork methodology. Yeah, and I like this idea. Ethnography. This is a book compilation. It's called the Urban Ethnography Reader. Sorry. Yeah, ethnography is one of those things that can be learned, but it is questionable whether it can be taught. A good teacher can, of course, provide exercise and advice on how to write field notes, how to conduct and structure interviews, and how to keep track of and analyze data. However, knowing how to make sense of the many, sometimes contradictory things the ethnographer encounters is perhaps something that it is learned only through doing. Yeah? Well, so I begin with a sort of obscure presentation. No, it's very difficult to really prescribe how do you do fieldwork, how do you do it, because I think it's a personal experience, isn't it? That's the idea of fieldwork per se, and otherwise we wouldn't do it. So, but even so, we can sort of, through this idea, bring some ideas or problems that can help to bring awareness towards your own process of doing fieldwork. Yeah, obviously on the final product that will be the written thesis or article or whatever you're going to do. Yeah. So the first thing that we have, or I had, is the learning by doing. So I'm going to show my own experience. That's the only thing I can do. Yeah. And the difficulties that I had through my own experience in the fieldwork and in the activism in general. So I began my fieldwork in 1994, working with the emergency travesti activism in Buenos Aires. For my thesis of anthropology in the University of Buenos Aires, I had to do fieldwork, so I decided to do urban anthropology. Yeah, I found it very interesting. I was going to work with communities, indigenous communities in Chaco. I changed my mind and I decided to work with the travestis. So this is my first immersion in the field work. That is when the travestis had the very first public act in the city in front of the presidential house, and demanding the stop of the killing from the police and to let them walk free on the streets. This is one of the central activists who later, as you will see, became my friend, Loana Berkins, and she's a quite famous trans woman activist in Buenos Aires. She died a couple of years ago. This is part of the same initial moment of my fieldwork. This is Maria Belén Correa. We are going to talk about later because she made the last year the Archivo de la Memoria Trans, which is, I'm going to talk about that as well, but it's a very important thing. So, the thing that you can see here is that these activists, first, the problem for me was, it was a very, I'm going to say, because it is very difficult to write and read. It was a complicated situation because I was thinking in my anthropological point of view as I learned at the university, but the problem was at that point that the travestis activists were showing that they were killed systematically by the police and the clients, and the police was all the time making razzias and take them in jail. So my field work, actually, when I wanted to talk to them, it was always sort of interrupted by the police, yeah? Because I had a meeting and then they didn't show up and I was like, my God, you didn't come, at 9 when I said it. And then you realize that they were in jail, yeah? So with this, the distinction between activism and fieldwork began to be blurred. Yeah, because you begin to have a connection and you have to make decisions. Where are you in this situation? Yeah. So eventually, this kind of problems between if I was they were native, I was an anthropologist, I was activist, what I was there and what were there. It didn't have an interest for me anymore. So this is one of the first prizes that they had, a community GLTBQ not Q yet, in Buenos Aires. As you can see, I was very young, always nice to show it. That's when Loana was coming here to New York for the first time to talk in front of the, I think, United Nations, and we were going with her to the airport to go with her. To help her. So another thing that I didn't do was writing field notes, all the things, logs, all the things that they say that you have to do. I never did it. Why? Because, I did it, but not so much. Because if you live in the same place as you are doing your field work, it's very difficult, isn't it? Because you come back to your house and you have to cook, or your friends are calling you, or you have a party, and I am not coming back to my house and writing down what I did. I also didn't know actually what was important. Yeah, it's very difficult to know how the field work is, and the methodology is organized in order to go to another place, and this is my next point. Yeah, all these ideas of methodology and fieldwork are related to our to the mark of the anthropology or ethnology as science, at the birth as a colonial science. Yeah. So the idea is that we move through the space to another place where these other people, very different from me, are. Yeah. So even the field notes is reflecting this. Yeah. I'm coming back to my tent and I'm going to write down, all the things that I saw. in this new context, this is sometimes is very difficult and not so reflected as such. Yeah. So what you have there is we are going to talk about this is an idea of space, place, and culture. Yeah, this was discussed in the end of the 90s a lot in anthropology. You have there one text of Gupta and Ferguson, who they are talking about this, and they wrote a beautiful book on that. No, representation of space in the social science are remarkably dependent on images of break, rupture, and disjunction. The distinctiveness of societies, nation, and culture is predicated on a seemingly unproblematic division of space, on the fact that they occupy naturally discontinuous spaces. Yeah. So my point here with this is not a COVID situation. Yeah, this is not new, as Melissa is showing. Digital fieldwork has been going on for many years. The problem is if you're doing face-to-face fieldwork, this discussion on the digital fieldwork is not going to come together, because it sort of bring problems or light on your own doing. Yeah, so we prefer to forget about this, and we do this, but we go back to the real thing, that is, we go there. So with this idea, we had to think, and this is important, that this idea of space, yeah, and I think with COVID, the situation of the space is sort of enlightened, if you want. Yeah, we can't move. Yeah, we can't go there, but even so, we are talking to them all the time. We are, having interactions all the time. So I think what the COVID is showing, that is what Melissa was showing, is already there. It was already there, and it's bringing problem to this idea of to constructing an other. Yeah. So how do we think these others that we want? Of course, the fieldwork is fun. Yeah. No one is going to, it's much more fun for me, at least. Probably Melissa and many other people will not agree to go then, to look through the computer. But I think there is a relation that is very important, that we have to reflect about that, and we have to reflect on paper when we are writing, when we are doing, both at both moments. Yeah. Sorry. Let me see. Well, I don't want to get lost. Yeah. So, in 1914, more than 20 years later, I was living in Switzerland, and through Facebook, keeping contact with my activist friends, I was invited to participate to the Archivo de la Memoria Trans. Yeah, the beginning of the Archivo de la Memoria Trans. I suppose some of you know them. They are becoming quite famous. They just published a book. They have more. They produce an archive with the pictures of travestis and trans women in Argentina and in other parts of the world. They have an archive of 7,000 pictures produced normally by their own travestis, no, and trans. They are publishing a big book. They are invited everywhere, and the work is really growing. It was shown in the Museo Reina Sofía, etc., etc. Yeah? So this project is a project on Facebook that María Belén Correa, this blonde one that you saw here, began when she was living in Hanover and sort of isolated. And this project is growing fast, because all the travestis and trans women around the world, they find the pictures of the friends, many killed, many missing, and they put the pictures, taking the photo and putting it in Facebook, and everyone is saying, okay, who is that one? Where is she? Is she dead? Last time they saw her, etc., etc. Yeah. So I think it's a very interesting platform, and is Facebook, as Melissa was saying, because also Facebook for trans women is an easy platform, isn't it? Like for me, you know, you don't have to do Instagram or these kind of fancy things, yeah. So after that, let me know if I am talking too much. I contact through Facebook one trans woman, and she talked me about Perica Burrometo. I knew from her from my friends in Buenos Aires in the 90s. She was exiled in Italy because she escaped from the police with. You know, they tried to kill her. She escaped from Buenos Aires with a passport of a friend, and she was in and you know, before the virtual world, she disappeared from our ideas because we didn't know where she was. And now, well, we knew that she was in Roma, and she invited me to go there. So that was my new field work. In Rome. So with Perica, I went to the zones of prostitution around Rome. Yeah, it's a sort of academic tourism of my. But it was a really very interesting field work that I did at that time, and the interviews and everything that I learned. But not just that she was talking about this, but she has a very good memory. So she was beginning to tell me about the things that happened to her in the 70s in Buenos Aires. Yeah, and this is how the idea of working on the nightlife of Buenos Aires in the 70s began to be interesting. Because what I am interested is in how the travesti identity per se appears. Yeah, that's my thing. Why the word even travesti? Yeah, because they were homosexuals before, then they were trans women. So what is the construction of travesti? Pamela, if I am too long, you let me know. 5 minutes, okay. So I know. Okay, so. In Buenos Aires, I had meetings with the old trans women from the Archivo de la Memoria Trans, and also I began to have contacts with other archives in Buenos Aires, like Moléculas Malucas and Archivos Desviados, who are constructing this memory of the old times of if you want, the gay or the queer life in Buenos Aires, yeah, and recovering from, you know, high repression, state repression, and society repression in Argentina. So what you can see also is how this work is merging different kind of experiences, if you want, digital experiences, but also what is important for me is that we are constructing connections and affective connections, if you want, and I think that's how the virtual and the real disappears, no? Through affective connection, that many of these people, I don't know them personally, I never saw them, but I talk to them 3 times per week, yes, seeing how the archives are doing and what do they need, and of course bringing whatever they need from here, because as you know, for Global South, the resources of the Global North are very expensive. So finally, I'm going to finish with this, but my idea then is that that's why I brought back also an old thing from my thesis courses, this idea that Lévi-Strauss brings in the Savage Mind, no, el pensamiento salvaje, on the bricoleur, yeah? And I think that's, it's a sort of, I don't know, I suppose it's a sort of optimist way of looking at the fieldwork in this mixed thing, yeah? What Lévi-Strauss is saying about the bricoleur, as you can see, is that the bricoleur works with things, with pieces of old artifacts that are brought to him by whatever he needed, yeah? And what you have is a set of tools and materials which are always finite and heterogeneous. And this is contingent. So the idea is that, and I really like, because I think that COVID is giving us this opportunity, sort of, yeah, to, of course, many problems, but some opportunities as well, to reflect on these two things working together, yeah. There is no such a thing as a construction of an object of investigation, and then you have the method, and then you go to the fieldwork. And so we have the connections all together working all the time, and we are doing all the time all the things. So what, for me, I will recommend is important is that you reflect on that when you are writing, in the process of writing the research, in the process of writing your articles, your thesis, etc., etc. This connection, which is so difficult to understand, that sometimes we prefer to, to leave it beside. We have to reflect on that, and I think it's going to bring light to some of the problems, such as how to think identity. What is the difference between that person and me, and how I am constructing these features as difference, yeah, and what are the things that we have in common, for instance. So hopefully, yeah, that's the idea, that we work with whatever we have. And I think, if you do a good work and if you are honest and keep an effective connection with the people you are working with, it's going to be fine. Well, that's it.
Gracias, Ana. Gracias. Pasamos entonces a Patricia.
Yes, thank you, Anna and Melissa, for your presentations. I'm going to share my experience as both a researcher and a supervisor working on Latin America from the UK. It's quite far, and it's also research in the humanities is something that doesn't get much funding. Therefore, the internet ends up being a really valuable resource to reflect on issues that also now are part of social reality, are part of the way in which people relate to each other. People use the internet to talk about themselves, and the issue of self-representation is one of the areas that is quite important for us, particularly in the 21st century, when we have seen how, in the case of indigenous peoples, for example, who were normally talked about, now we are seeing a moment where they talk about themselves, and in their own terms, and also using for many different purposes what is available to them, and the internet is something that they definitely use. So I will give two examples of master's thesis that I recently supervised to tell you how the students, well, first the research questions they had and how they approached them, and the topics that they did. One was on home tourism and the use that Maya communities did in Mexico and in Guatemala to advertise their offer. And one of the first findings in the research was that these imagined equality in accessing the resource of the internet didn't actually work. In one case, in the case of the Mexican Maya communities, they hired an agent to build the page and to create all the imagery, even taking the photos. So this is something they did. They were the community were the main agent, but they didn't want to do it on their own. They decided to hire a professional who gave them access to the page. And then what was evident was that once the page was created and existed, they had really not updated it. There was no live input in the page. And therefore, it was just a mask, something that was dead. But in spite of that, because several travel agencies had links to this website, they could manage to get people coming in their communities, and therefore have a rather successful business of homestay tourism. Whereas the other community, that was a Maya community, where one of the young people in the community created a Facebook page, etc., had a much more dynamic presence, updating by the week the kind of things they had, filming with mobile phones, events and dances and all of those things. So the page looked a lot more lively, but because they didn't have the connections with travel agencies, it wasn't really working as a business, no? And so there are these two examples where our student followed for some time, engaged in correspondence with the communities, and finally got small funding to visit the places. No? So it was online research based on forms of self-representation for indigenous businesses in the 21st century. No? And the findings were quite interesting, particularly regarding this gap in knowledge and access and contacts. No? And finally, the issue of how the ability to connect does not necessarily solve the problem of accessing a global market. No? So it was a very specific project comparing the access to the internet in two communities, but also going into the characteristics of the contents, and how in some case, in the case of the Facebook page, there was very interesting process of ethnogenesis, self-invention of them as indigenous, because before the possibility of having a homestay tourism, this particular community did not really see themselves as Maya people, even though they were in terms of heritage and use of the language, etc. But the context allowed them to reinvent themselves as indigenous, whereas the other community, recognized in Mexico as an indigenous community, etc., went for the more professional channel, but when they had the resource in their own hands, they were not able to update it and actually keep up with it. No, so it's quite an interesting example of access, and most of the work was done from here, and then she only had 3 or 4 weeks to visit the communities and actually feel the field, no? And have more lively conversations and the experience of the performative aspect of the homestay experience, no? That it also, in one case, the communities had imposed on themselves to perform their indigeneity. So that is one case. The other case is in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, with an indigenous group within the city of Sao Paulo. They live in an island inside the city, she was working, our student was working with YouTube videos of hip hop artists, of indigenous Brazilians who do hip hop. And then he identified these 3 hip hop bands and started looking at the production of the videos. No? And what she analyzed were all these different levels of self-representation, the lyrics and how they speak as original inhabitants of this place, and how, unlike the representation that the city has about the favelados as people who invaded the city, these were inhabitants of our originary territory that had been invaded by the city. No? So there is an element of content, of narrative, of their history, and of the symbols that they use to state these by filming mountain in Sao Paulo that is a sacred being for them, by also analyzing the ethnic markers that they used in the videos, but not necessarily on everyday life. So again, this performativity of indigeneity through videos And then she also compared access to the production tools, no? In some cases with film studies, with cinema producing students, and in others, more or less DIY technologies, no? All done by themselves. And reflecting also on these access to media and means of production and access to technology and the use of the videos. With a final sort of audience study, we could say, when she looks at the Facebook pages and the reaction of the audiences in the YouTube videos, comparing which songs had more likes or views. And there was not necessarily an association between the quality of the production and the audience of these bands, no? So there is another question, do people like it because of what they say, or do people like it because they are well made, no? And so again, the answer related to the self-representation and the contents and engagement with the audience, no? In this case. So those are two cases regarding indigenous peoples and self-representation. And the other one, the most recent one, is a PhD project that had to change due to the pandemic. This is one of our students who went to Peru before the pandemic because she wanted to see the relationship between literacy, school literacy, alphabetical literacy, and the transmission of knowledge in other forms of inscribed meaning, weaving, carving, etc. And she wanted to see in two communities if there was a continuous learning and transmission of knowledge from mothers to daughters in terms of inscribing meaning in textiles and carvings, regardless of the presence of the schools, or if school literacy had diminished this type of access to traditional knowledge. It all went out because she had to come back. But what was interesting was that as a first phase of her fieldwork, she was taking Quechua lessons. And so she had a lot of experience and reflections because she had been in different places learning Quechua. And then when she came back, she wanted to continue studying Quechua while she was thinking how to reformulate her project. But her Quechua lessons had been part of her fieldwork, and she had lots of notes on the different methods and approaches by teachers, etc. So she's now working on online teaching of Quechua in the world and how Quechua teaching has also become a way or not, has become or not a way of trying to communicate a different worldview. So when do teachers have an approach of teaching Quechua as a language, and when and how teachers approach online teaching of Quechua as a culture? And this is more or less what she's looking at now. So she's looking at this link between language and culture and how it is communicated in this context of online classes in Peru, Ecuador, the US, and in these three places, in 2 places in Peru, 1 in Ecuador, and 1 in the US. And another interesting element in this is that lots of people with Quechua heritage are using the pandemic to learn Quechua online, which is something that they always wanted to do, but now have the opportunity of doing it. And they are using the classes to reflect on their heritage as well. So this seems to be like a new thing happening. And she is registering what she finds. She has asked for permission to all the teachers to record the lessons, and then she's conducting in-depth interview with some of the participants in these classes. So this is the other project that has emerged as part of this circumstance, where also a new phenomena is emerging, because one of the things that she has engaged in is this understanding of online teaching now, not as distance education, but as an emergency reaction, where we are using all these technologies to continue doing what we do, because most of us are not trained in distance education, which is a completely different thing. And so what she's doing is to also observing how these adaptations are occurring and how people are using these technologies in language teaching, which has also become an area in itself. No? So these are three scenarios, three projects that I just wanted to share. We can talk about them, but they have all been challenging and very interesting in the findings, because all these issues of access to technology, literacy, language, in the case of the businesses, the issues of being literate in the language of advertising also becomes quite interesting. And so I've learned a lot by supervising these students, and I guess we are going to continue learning from whatever this situation throws at us, and also the reality of the forms of relationship and communication that emerge through these processes. No, yes. So I can leave it there, I think.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Melissa. It's been really rich to listen to the three of you. I'm going to now pass it on to Daniel so he can direct the Q&A facet of this event. Adelante.
Yes, thank you, Pamela. And thank you again to all of our speakers. I'm sure all of us with our cameras off and muted are giving you a round of applause, because this has been amazing so far. And in a sense, we're just getting started, because we have time for a pretty robust Q&A, which I'm excited about. So I have a few questions that I'm going to start with, I think, but in the meantime, I'm also going to be monitoring the chat. So anyone in the audience, if you have some questions that you want to ask, you can go ahead and drop those in the chat, and then I'll try to synthesize them and sort of like curate them as time goes on. But while you're doing that, and while you're formulating your questions, I have a few questions, I guess, to get started with. And sort of a general theme, I think, in all of my questions is sort of playing with this idea that when we're doing digital field work, in some ways this is different than what we call traditional methodologies, but in some ways it's not. And one thing that I noticed is there seems to be very similar themes and similar issues that methodological issues that we deal with in both. So Melissa, actually, if you don't mind, if I can start with you. One thing that you said that really stood out to me that got me thinking is this issue of when you were talking about the way Facebook or other companies will moderate content, right? And so this affects sort of like what content is available, what's not, and that raises methodological issues. However, don't traditional archives also intervene, or traditional libraries intervene in the content as well? So I would just be really curious to hear you sort of reflect on what do you see are the similarities in the way that works in traditional archives, but also I think there probably are some differences as well too. So I don't know, I'd be curious to hear you reflect on that question to get us started.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you are totally right to make that parallel. It is 100% accurate. And you think about the gatekeeping role to information throughout history. It's just located at different pieces of the collection, storage, and dissemination workflow, right? So with archives, of course, just the way we describe the collections is a barrier. is a taxonomy, sometimes, in many cases, historically designed specifically to exclude certain communities from access to their own intellectual production. And so there's, of course, I mean, all the questions about cultural patrimony and ownership and access, and the whole field of digital repatriation, which I have never quite been able to think through as the right solution, although it's, you know, there are, of course, reasons why that would be an option available. So yeah, certainly. How is it different today? I think the programmatic nature of extraction for the purpose of discovery is really different, because even the programmers who write the algorithms, and you're talking about many, many people here, it's a distributed process creating the code. Google updates its algorithm like twice a day. It's just a constant moving target. Even those who create the algorithms have no way of double checking why a decision was made, which just blows my mind. There is no way to understand why this, not that, because of the complexity of the algorithms that have been put in place. And so, but because they offer ease, they're adopted so quickly. So of course, the penal system is in Exhibit A for how inappropriately quickly algorithmic decision-making has been incorporated into sentencing guidelines. Assessing risk. There was an article, I think it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education this week, about how universities are assessing students at risk based on an algorithm that is black box, right? That means we don't get to look at it, we don't get to test it. So who knows, right? And when you run individuals through it, when you do freedom of information requests and you take a look at that data, you find, surprise, surprise, it is the Black and Latino students who are marked as higher risk more frequently, and their advisors are urged to steer them into less risky majors. And so the programmatic nature of predictive technologies and the ease with which they can be inserted into all manner of decision-making, all areas of our life, is vast. And I think that differentiates it from the kind of gatekeeping and decision-making that custodians, cultural preservationists, in cultural heritage institutions, libraries, archives have done in the past. That's not to say there is not a whole ethical minefield there, of course, but it's really well documented. And I think the profession of librarianship, information studies, archival science is taking a really hard look at all of those things and working through those issues. So for example, at the New York Public Library, we have a grant we just got with the Brooklyn Public Library to help us change offensive taxonomy in our catalog relating to undocumented immigrants. So we are undertaking the labor and the cost of changing the subject heading illegal alien to undocumented immigrant in order to make our access points more legitimately accessible to the community we serve. And so there are lots of examples of how archivists, librarians, information professionals are undertaking that labor. But on the tech side of things in Silicon Valley, when people raise their voice, they get fired because it's the private sector. And so the gatekeeper role of the private sector is also a differentiating feature, I think. But there's so much meat to your question. I mean, you could write a whole book on that, but I think just to sort of quickly answer it, I think that's the difference.
Several.
Right, exactly. Off the top of my head, that would be like sort of the main differences, but I'm sure there are many others, and there are many other points of similarity as well.
Well, that's an amazing answer. I really appreciate it. I think the most obvious answer would have been that there's a difference between the private sector and public sector, but you gave some amazing examples of how also in the public sector and nonprofits like universities, this issue of black box algorithms is still a factor. So that was a great
scary.
Answer. Gave me a lot of things to think about. Yes, scary, yeah, for sure. But it definitely gave me a lot of things to think about that that wasn't on my radar before. So I appreciate that. Let me ask a question while the chat is filling up. I see a couple of questions rolling in, which is awesome. Let me ask Anna a question in the meantime. Similar, I guess, to the question that I gave Melissa is this theme of how different is digital ethnography or digital research, or is it, how much is it actually just similar to what we're doing? I mean, you raised a very interesting question of if ethnography or anthropology is observing someone in the spaces where they live, But as modern people, we live on the internet in a lot of ways. Is all fieldwork digital at this point? Like, is there a such thing as anthropology that doesn't have a digital component anymore? I don't know, to what extent can I just say that all fieldwork is digital fieldwork, at least on some level?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I was learning with when Pamela pushed me to this conference because I don't reflect on the things I do. I had to say I am zero reflection. Reflexivity is not my second nature, but I think so. And also that's the problem, isn't it? Because that's why I'm thinking it's very difficult to keep this idea of methodology as it was before, that you can write, I don't have the time. And I have to say, I don't know, but I assume my students is the same. It's much more fun to go to Facebook and chat to your friend and then, be 2 hours writing, okay, this one said about the other one, that blah, 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 blah. Yeah, and that is gossip. And of course, there are many books on gossiping and in the communities. And of course, it's going to be a great work, but it's boring for me, at least. So as you're saying, Daniel, I think it's changing the idea of thinking something as virtual and something as real. And that's the good thing, isn't it? And this is that's the good thing for me, at least. I suppose for many people, and Melissa's show was showing that they were already working. And I think it's also a generational thing. For me, I am old, that's the truth. As many of the students are going to say, when they begin to explain about Instagram, I'm, oh my God, I don't care. I don't have so much time. Don't give me. So I am with Facebook as the travestis and trans women, because also you have to check. And I think this is the thing that are more interesting, perhaps, to think about the virtual fieldwork. Why you can use some platforms and not the others? Which kind of access do you have and you don't have the others? What is related to your own life situation, your mobility, your precarity? Talking about migrants communities, you don't have the sense of home is yourself and your mobile. So I think this kind of thing for me is more interesting than going to say. And also another thing that is very good of the virtual fieldwork is that you have the research there. I have to go to Facebook and it takes a bit long, but and this is something that, yes, you have to do, is to, put in your hard disk all the conversations you had in Facebook, because that's, once it's gone, it's gone. And this kind of thing, you're going to find your own fieldwork through this data that sadly, this is not your own, but you are working there. So yeah. Sorry, I don't know if I answered, but yeah, it's complicated.
If nothing else, I encourage you to reflect. Go ahead, Patricia.
Yes, on the issue of is every fieldwork now also virtual, I think that in some areas it definitely is. I study activism, for example. And a big part of the events that take place in the street are planned and talked about before in the social networks and then commented on after they happened. And there are people who are also following mobilizations in the November protests in Peru. It was so interesting to see, following Instagram, for example, how they were informing each other of where the police was coming, also giving instructions on how to ¿cómo se dice? Apagar bombas lacrimógenas, to extinguish, tear gas bombs, etc. And so they are a tool, they are an archive, they are a planning resource. And so if you are interested in social movements, you see contents developing, debates happening, that are not obviously the same as what happens in the streets, but have become a big part of it before, during, and after, particularly as an archival device, as a source for memory and discussion about the events. So this, in my area, it definitely is a big part of the fieldwork. And in my case, being in the UK, it has given me almost immediate access to a lot of things that were happening that later on I have been able to talk about with the people I follow, that I interview, or but yes, definitely my fieldwork has been in 2017 and 19 for quite some time, a few months in Lima, but all of the rest of my information has been through the internet, either by interviews, videos, or this type of register of the events by thousands of people.
And can I just jump in and add that there's a historian whose name escapes me who has recently presented, I think 2 years ago, when MLA, or when the American Historical Association conference was in New York. He said all historical research is digital now, for the sole reason that the luxury of sitting in an archive and going through documents is an increasingly rare one. And really archival use, the practice is to go in, take a whole bunch of photos and leave. And then you work with the photographic representation of that. You're not working with the actual documents anymore. The volume, the digital humanities, using computational methods to look at those materials. So there is this claim that all history is digital now. I'm not sure I would go quite that far, but I think it's a legitimate observation to make just because of changing methods.
Yeah, I can confirm that's definitely what I'm doing. Literally yesterday, I was in my office transcribing documents from a PDF from the last time I was in the archive, and just took a bunch of photos. So yeah, that's the way we do history now. Let me pose a couple of other questions. Another question that I was going to ask Patricia, but actually Marchita's version of this question in the chat is very similar. So let me see if I can kind of combine these. Actually, for Patricia and Ana as well, I think is this question of identity. And I think Patricia, you used the word perform several times. It's this issue of sort of performing identity, which again, it's interesting because in-person field work, there would also be a performing identity component. Some people have argued that all culture at a fundamental level is just performance. But at the same time, there's different sort of aspects of this performance. I do think it's safe to say that when we're dealing with a digital performance, that there are some differences. So I would be curious to hear you, and actually Ana as well, with sort of performing identity with the people that you work with. Do you see some differences in the way this performance works in in-person field work versus digital field work? And to throw in, I guess, another element of this, I keep using the word performance, but Marchita is asking a question. Would it make sense to call this an interruption or a fragmentation of someone's identity when we start to add in these digital components? And is that if it is a fragmentation, has that become more intense during the pandemic? I don't know, that's quite a bit to unpack, but I'll just throw it to both of you. Why don't you get us started, Patricia?
Yes, it is indeed. There is a lot to unpack there. When I use the word performing identity, I was thinking in the specific case of the homestay tourism, because these are circumstances where people have to satisfy an audience, the tourist, and being indigenous, maybe in a very conscious way that is not the normal day. So my student would tell me, for example, how she observed that some of the women wouldn't braid their hair on the day they didn't have visitors in the community. But then they donned their indigenous attire, full attire that they wouldn't normally do. And I have seen these in Puno as well, in Peru, you know. So there is an element where you commodify elements of your identity for a consumer, because that's what they are paying for. That doesn't mean that you have a different relationship with your culture. So there are lots of things that the market has imposed. Also with the representation that the public has of what an indigenous person is. And in some cases, those performances have been shaped by complaints. of, oh, my house wasn't as authentic as the other one, things like that, no? So it also, there is a market for this kind of thing. So in that sense, I think that the specific case of homestay tourism imposes some kind of performance to satisfy the consumer. And that is something that the communities do understand, no? There are other cases in which you may decide to reinforce an element of your identity when you want to make a point about it. So I think this is something we all do all the time, no? But in this case of, using the internet for self-representation purposes, I think it opens a lot of questions, but also make us look at the agency and the decisions that the users of these media do on an everyday basis, depending on whatever they want to convey, through these media, where you are actually producing, as you use the keyboard, as you upload images, it is a process of production of a representation of yourself, no? When you send an email or you are in a chat, you are composing something, carefully using the words that no? So it is all a myriad of small decisions that you take in order to present yourself at that particular moment. And so I think that the very fact that you have to produce, mount, put together things, imply decisions where you are constructing something for other. So
I don't know, how would you build on that, Anna?
Difficult. Well, I'm going. Well, no. What I think that it's, Patricia was saying, the idea of commodification of identities, isn't it? And this is related, of course, to globalization. Yeah, and we are. Patricia, in her examples, in mine, obviously, with trans women working in the sex work industry, exactly, you have a target. How do you have to be more, for instance, indigenous, more, you are selling exoticism in Europe, for instance, and you have to have particular features, so you work with that. But my point in general is that we have to think this commodification of identities in general with ourselves, especially through this kind of technologies, because we become visual. Yeah, all the kind of other affective sense that we have through this kind of technologies begins to disappear. And what you have more is the visual thing, isn't it? And I think this is giving a component that is changing. And is, as Patricia was giving this example, no, you had to put your hair in certain way. You begin to look at this kind of thing, not what you are saying, but the way you are performing or showing. What are you showing? So in this sense, I think it's a change. But my point here is, I think we are much, we are behind our objects, at least in my case, way behind. Yeah. And in activism, it's the same, because it's a matter of survival. It's a survival kit to use the technologies. If the police is coming, you have to be clever enough to produce some WhatsApp groups in order to, they caught us when I was a young person, against fighting against the police, because of course they had to shout at you, they are coming. If you didn't run enough, they got you. But now there are other technologies, and I think in this sense we have to realize and be conscious that that's the problem with the native, isn't it? The native, because it can be much more clever than us. So we are sort of going behind, no? I don't know if it was an answer, but it's a thing.
No, that's a great answer. And I think, raising the issue of WhatsApp groups is also very interesting, because it's much more underground than like a Facebook group, for example. So that's raises a whole another set of sort of questions about the way people live their lives digitally, and what the researcher has access to and doesn't have access to. And I think Marchita's point in the chat is also very interesting about this idea of viewing this as sort of like an issue, like what Patricia and Ana are both saying, is the issue of the audience. seems to matter, right? Like that's going to change the performance. And so in person versus digitally, that's a different audience and a global audience, I guess, when it's digital. And so this raises questions about, are we standardizing indigenous identity? Is this part of like a process of standardization, or maybe, as James C. Scott would say, a reduction of vernaculars? So yeah, I think there's excellent points that you're raising, Marchita. Let me switch to another question, though, or another set of questions that Barbara was posing a bit earlier for Melissa, and this question of sort of like the racial biases that come up in technology and in these algorithms and things like this. So I know we don't know, like you said, it's black box issues, so we don't know a lot about how these things are created, and arguably the people who create them don't even fully understand them because it's entire teams. So there's this question of intentionality, though. So is this some just giant weird side effect, or is there some intentionality with these to sort of confirm racial biases? What are your thoughts on that issue? And then a second question that Barbara poses, along with this issue of racial biases and the algorithms and where those come from, the origins of those. There's also this issue of, if it's changing so constantly, like as researchers, how do we keep up? Like, how does that inform the way we should be doing research if these things are changing day to day? And research obviously takes longer than that.
Yeah.
I don't know, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so just to quickly go back to the previous question, just briefly, because the question of identity and performing different identities to secure access to the internet is very common, particularly in indigenous communities. And this I've observed in online data the world over. You see it in press releases that governments issue when they have wired a rural area, when they talk about uplift as the primary rationale for extending technological access to remote communities, which are overwhelmingly indigenous peoples. And so while in an ideal world, access is provided as a right because we have a right to communicate. That's a stated piece of human rights international law. It's long understood to be true. And yet, that's not the reason that these communities are getting access to participate in the global conversation, to communicate. They're not getting it on a rights claim. They're not successful when they make a rights claim. They have to say, oh, look, we can sell our wares to the world if you wire us so we can have a shop of our indigenous goods. We have, cultural patrimony in the form of this particular kind of chile that is only grown in this particular region, and we can sell it and we can make our culture, it's about supporting themselves economically, about not being a burden on the state. That is the rationale that is successful. And they just want internet access. So at the end of the day, they're going to use the rhetoric that gets them connected. And then their kids are going to use it for video games, like kids in the rest of the world, because that's part and parcel of having a communication infrastructure, is to use it in different ways depending on your generation. But it's only given as a sort of, well, you're going to use this for approved economic growth purposes because you're poor. And therefore, we need you to lift yourselves out with this help. So it's really perverse kind of logic. And it does force you to assume an identity that you don't really believe, just to get this access so that you can participate in the global, equal footing. So that's a whole, that happens. Even in the information science world, we contend with issues of identity, right?
No, that's an excellent, addition to this conversation. Thank you.
So then the next question is about intentionality. And I think that's a, culpability.
Or just in general, where does it come from? Is it inherent? Are these algorithms inherently racially biased? Is it the way that they're used, the way they're constructed?
I mean, when you talk to programmers who say, well, this is, it's not biased. It's just the data that it's, we didn't build a system that's biased. It's you fed it the wrong data, right? That's always the answer. Our system works perfectly well. You just fed it biased data. And to me, that's willful blindness. And so I do feel there is some culpability to assign there, right? Because there is a way to change the infrastructure to handle biased data, because we know it's hard to collect unbiased data. So I think that you could say there is some intentionality if there is a willful negligence to address a very well-documented problem. So I think, yes, some of these things are, intentionally biased, but everyone would deny it. No. It's the system's beautiful. It's perfect. You just don't know how to use it. It's user error, right? So that's usually the way that they handle it.
It's a very, very neoliberal answer, isn't it?
Oh yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Like the market, auto-regulated. It does. If you are poor, it's because it's your fault. You didn't do something correctly. Otherwise, you will be fine. No, I think it's well, technology is part of the same logic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, and an additional question that Barbara had for you, Melissa, was this other issue of, if the technology is moving so quickly and changing so quickly, like as researchers, how are we supposed to keep up, or how does that inform the methods that we should be using?
Yeah, I mean, it's like sticking, your foot into a moving river, right? It's not the same. And when you go back to it, so there are all kinds of very practical problems about data collection. If you can't collect all of your data at the same moment in time, you're collecting a data set that has shifted while you're collecting it. And so that makes the analysis very complicated. It's an acknowledged problem. No one, one cannot get around that. So like if you're researching, let's say, how search engines make certain content visible, and you conduct one set of searches today, but you didn't finish it, you finish it in the next day, maybe the results have already sort of shifted, or maybe they changed the weight that your IP address was given, was calculated in terms of what gets displayed and preferential order of things. And so there's a lot of moving parts, and there really is no way to put your finger on it once and for all and say, this is how, this is an unbiased data set that can tell us exactly at this moment in time what was happening. It's very, very hard. So accounting for that as a researcher is important. You need to design your research understanding that there is no stable data set. That's hard, but if you look at the way research is construed, the way they scope it out, you look at their research questions and their methods in information science, and you can account for that in the way that you construct the study and what data set you use for what purposes. So there's that. For humanities disciplines, I think it's less of an issue, because a lot of the programmatic engagement with content is a corpus that you've developed that you oftentimes host separately, right? So you build a database of content, of texts that you then mine. And so you sort of isolate, though you control the tweaks to the algorithm. Maybe you've worked with a computer scientist grad student or something to develop the way in which you're going to extract data from this corpus that you've developed. So it's kind of a different, I don't think it hits humanities disciplines as much. That's my sort of flip answer to that. I have not at all investigated or researched. That's just my sense, that it does not affect the humanities, the digital humanities, in the same way as it would the social sciences.
Yeah, I think that's a fair answer. And I think it's something that we advise students a lot who are writing their thesis is like, show your work, right? And so be very transparent, I guess, about the scope. And if this is information that was gathered during this particular period of time, be clear about, this is a dynamic data set that is constantly changing, and I'm evaluating what I gathered for this period, right? And the more you show your work, yeah, I think the humanities, there's some forgiveness there, even if you can say, like, this information might be slightly outdated now because of X, Y, and Z variables, but this is the data set that I've gathered. So I think it's a very fair answer and a fair point. All right, so I'm looking through the chat to see. You want to jump in, Pamela?
Yeah, I just have a question, because I'm an anthropologist, and I do worry about connectivity and what you all said. Anna mentioned the affective. Do not ever lose the affective, because that's where the virtual and the in reality fieldwork will sort of like touch. They're going to touch, because there's this affective relationship that you're building with people, right? So given what Patricia said, that being in the internet is sort of like it's a composition of yourself, it's a production of yourself. The same for the activists that you work with, or the trans people that you work with, Anna, and from everything that Melissa said, you produce yourself. And how are you as anthropologists, as researchers, have been able to maintain connectivity, to maintain relations, to maintain that flow of building relationships? I think that's the hardest part on online virtual research, ethnography. And I would like you to share your feelings about that and your strategies.
Well, I would say that generally, I feel that the existence of this type of connectivity facilitates the continuity of the relationship, because as Anna was saying, you know, our work as anthropologists is not necessarily working at home, no, in your city. You go somewhere else, and maintaining the relationship is quite difficult would be difficult if we didn't have this. And also going back to my students, one of them, for example, graduated 6 years ago, and she's still in touch through Facebook with the community where she did her fieldwork, and in a very active way. And so Facebook has allowed her to maintain attachment to the community. And in my case, I continue not interviewing anymore, but chatting or having video calls with a group of the people I worked with to comment on current events. No? So we keep the conversation. The research is over. I'm already writing up, trying to finish, but the conversation continues. And I think that, at least in my case, social media has allowed me to keep these virtual friendships that are not similar to the kind of relationship I could maintain when I was working in Peru, with people with whom I don't have contact anymore. I used to work in rural schools with teachers. They have found me on Facebook. And so in some cases, I have been able to, restart the connection. But yeah, I would say it's a different world in terms of this type of connectivity, and the sense of immediacy it gives you, even though you're miles away and you'll probably never see each other again, but there is this feel of connection that remains, and the fantasy that, somehow you'll see each other sometime. But yeah, I think that is that part of the reality of or the dimension of connectivity that we are experiencing now. It's something to reflect on, and to think what it means. But it feels different.
Yeah, one thing that I think I didn't stress out enough is, for the students who are thinking in the fieldwork research, this is a great opportunity, because we are all inside houses, and the thing is, what the virtual is, or the virtuality is giving you, is the opportunity to begin to connect. Because it's not that you go to the fieldwork and suddenly, if you go to Buenos Aires now and you have a month to I don't know, to have do fieldwork in the Villa 31 on the feminist movement, you're going to spend 2 weeks trying to talk to someone and see if they are going to talk to you, because people have lives and they have things to do. You have the opportunity now to begin slowly through Facebook. Probably you are going to find WhatsApp connections, etc., to make these connections, in order that when you are in Buenos Aires, or wherever you are going to be for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, or with luck 2 months, you are already somehow you have already a relation. So I will say, even if you're not sure what is going to be your object of research, begin to work in any direction. Because coming back to this idea of recolor, you are going to work with whatever you have in your hands, yeah? And with that, you are going to do something, but it's not the opposite. You are going to, my project is, I'm going to Colombia in the middle of, I don't know where, in the jungle, I'm going to do this. Well, it cannot happen, yeah? So do the opposite. Begin to work now and do it slowly. And you're going to see that these connections are going to bring you to another place, and you're going to be very happy with whatever the results are, even if are not at all what you thought.
Yeah. In my case, this project on youth activism started through Facebook. It didn't exist before, and I started messaging people with the Facebook Messenger, and that's how I contacted them when I was in Lima. And for the first time in my life, I was able to conduct 17 interviews in less than 20 days because I made contacts before going to Peru, and everybody was willing, you know, and it was incredible. But in the old days, probably I would have those interviews in, I don't know, chasing after people for months, luckily, you know, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is how this ties into the question of the researcher identity. So and establishing trust with your communities in advance of meeting them in person. So I find easier to establish that trust now through virtual platforms, so that when you do meet in person, there is a more meaningful exchange that is less awkward, and you can dispense with a lot of the sort of, face-to-face vetting of each other, because you already know them a little bit. And that's made easier because of the way that a digital platform allows you to present what you want to present. So you construct the identity you want them to see. Whereas when you meet someone face-to-face, they're going to see whatever they see. And, you know, what can you do about that? So it does offer a way in that I think can be beneficial.
Susanna has posted a series of some really good questions. So let me see if I can try to synthesize these. First off, for those of you who are looking for a research project, Susanna posted a really interesting one. Instead of sending anthropologists into the village, we should send them to Silicon Valley to observe programmers making the algorithm. I'm only half joking. That's actually, I think, a really interesting idea.
This is happening. This is happening. Yeah.
Yeah. The other questions, though, so some more practical questions, I guess, is this issue of, like, for students getting started. So someone who doesn't already have contacts in these countries or in these places where they're hoping to do this research or doing digital research, like, what are your recommendations for establishing that initial contact and sort of like getting started, early steps? And then a follow-up question to that, if we're relying so much on sort of like using these internet identities to connect with people, is this maybe creating some limitations that we should be worried about in terms of who we're contacting? So yeah, I think those are the
Sorry, I had to say that. I had to say. I love this because this is this idea of who is for instance, your informant in your village. Yeah, and that was the problem for Malinowski, and that's the problem now. Yeah, it's exactly the same. Who do you choose that's going to talk to you? The person who, you know, has a sort of connection. You have a sort of same kind of discursive field. So this discussion is exactly the same with the internet, isn't it? My point is, coming back to that, is once you are in the field with people, the everyday field, to say it in some way. I'm sure there are words already, but everyday field. You are going to contact first to the people you were talking or you met through internet, but then you are going to be there. And, you know, when you are there, you're going to be the mother, the uncle, and the things change in this situation. So I think, of course, you have limitations, as you have limitations with everything. But first, and this is an important thing, I'm coming back to the same idea. Of course, if you are trying to go to the last tribe in the Amazon, it's going to be difficult that they have access to internet. And the many people in Bolivia, in Peru, in Argentina have, and here, have problems with access to internet, but many people don't. So you begin in some place, and this, I'm coming back, that's what you have now. You work with this. But another thing that, sorry, I'm going to jump quickly on that, is I don't think you show, you know, I am not so sure that we show what we want to show. I think we create something, and I don't control so much, well, as you can see, the way I behave. Yeah, but I think what for me is important is giving you virtual, the virtual world is the time to construct trust links with other people. You know, it's a very short thing, but you know, sometimes they need something, or it's not something you have to call friends or ask someone, or they need a you know, it happens to me when I was in Zurich. They don't know how to, you know, someone was in prison, they don't know how to get a lawyer, or small things or big things. But this is to be present through virtuality is going to bring you, when you are in the everyday place, already a knowledge of the place, and they are going to have a knowledge of you. So I think that's the most important thing. I don't think it's so important that you have the final idea of the research. You're going to find the people you are interested, because you are going to see that, and you know, you're going to construct some kind of bonding. So the only thing is, begin to work now. Whatever you're going to do, begin to work now. Yeah. Sorry, my.
Another thing to for Susana, there are always limits. Unlimited access to people doesn't exist. And whatever you do, it's always going to begin somewhere. And the thing is to be aware of those limits and to make them explicit for you from the start, no? Because you will never have total access. There will be people who won't talk to you, regardless of who introduces you to each other. No, so this building of trust always has limits, and accessing anyone, anywhere is always going to be a risk, a challenge that sometimes you may succeed, sometimes don't, and you know you didn't. But the important thing is to, as Anna says, to start working and to learn the limits of what you're doing and be very conscious about them, and don't get frustrated, because any bit of information is important, is useful, and it can take you somewhere. No, and so there is no project that stays the same from when it was written to the first day of fieldwork. The situation shapes your work, and you have to be aware of how it changes and the limits you're going to find, etc. So it's yeah, just to round up the ideas.
Okay, so well, at this point it is 12:25. So Pamela, is this the point where we should be wrapping up, I guess? Oh, you need to unmute yourself to give your final words.
No, yeah, you're right. And I think this has been a rich, wonderful exchange between all of us. And I would love you to close the event with some kind of reflection. Thank you. I really thank
of course.
Anna, Melissa, and Patricia for their insights and for the questions of our students and the larger audience. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah, same. I echo that. And the engagement in the chat was amazing. Marchita, Barbara, Susana, and all the people who are contributing questions to really make this a really rich and robust discussion. And I think I guess the final point that I guess I want to conclude with is like, as we've seen today, that this entire field of research existed long before we had a pandemic, right? And so I think one of the things that's important for us to realize, or I guess is to keep in mind, is even if we end up changing our projects, they're not exactly what we originally intended because of the limitations of the pandemic. I don't think that makes the projects less robust. And in some sense, it actually makes them more robust in some of the examples that I've seen where someone had to pivot on their project. And I think it was actually ended up being better when they started tapping into sort of these resources and these methodologies that people have been building for a while. But that maybe people weren't looking into when they probably should have been. So I think like this conversation has just been very sort of like inspiring for me, and I think in a very optimistic sense, that this is a really innovative time to be doing research, and this is a moment, regardless of perhaps restrictions that the pandemic might have imposed. This is really an innovative time, where I think people are really on the vanguard and pushing sort of the way that their research is done, I think in really, really important and powerful ways that are going to have an effect on these disciplines for a long time. Like Melissa was saying, like history is already changing. It's already become completely digital. I think anthropology is already changing. And so as much as Anna admitted that she doesn't like to reflect on what she does, reflection is important, right? And I thank you for coming here and doing that for us. And I think for all of you too, I think it's great to not just plan sort of like what you're going to do methodologically, but also to zoom out, right? And think about like, what does this mean for the fields? And I think we're in a position where we're not just contributing to the field, but I think we're shaping it, and I think we're changing it. And so, and we got to hear from 3 people today who were, again, like I said, on the vanguard, I think of reshaping the fields and changing the way research is done. And so I'm excited that everyone in this room, many of you who are going to be writing theses very soon, are going to be part of that process, right? And you're going to be shaping the field and changing it, just like these presenters today. So that being said, let's just give one final round of applause to our professors and to all of you for the amazing engagement and note-taking and brainstorming and thinking that all of you are doing right now. It's going to be a great weekend. Your minds are going to be active. And so I'm really excited about that.
Thank you, Patricia, Melissa, and Anita.
Thank you.